After a weekend with his mistress, his pregnant wife sold the house, vanished without a trace. The California sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Miller mansion in Beverly Hills. Sadie Miller, 7 months pregnant, stood in the nursery doorway, her hand resting gently on her rounded belly. Soft yellow paint covered the walls. They had decided to wait to learn the baby's gender, wanting that moment of surprise when their child arrived. "Just 2 more months, little one," she whispered, running her fingers over the carefully assembled crib. The mobile above it featured delicate butterflies that caught the afternoon light, casting dancing shadows across the room. Her phone buzzed. Andrew's name appeared on the screen. "Hey, beautiful." His voice carried that familiar warmth that had made her fall in love with him 8 years ago. "Just wanted to check in before my meetings get crazy." "How are you and our little miracle doing?" Sadie smiled, settling into the rocking chair they'd picked out together just last week. "We're good. Baby's been active today. I think he or she is excited about the new room." "I wish I could be there to feel the kicks," Andrew said, and she could hear the slight rustle of papers in the background. "This client is demanding, but the contract we're closing will set us up beautifully for when the baby comes. Just think, I'll be able to take a whole month off when you give birth." "I know you're working hard for us," Sadie replied, though something felt different in his voice today, a distance that hadn't been there before. "When will you be back from San Francisco?" "Sunday evening, like I told you. I'll bring dinner from that Italian place you love, the one with the garlic bread you've been craving." After they hung up, Sadie continued organizing baby clothes, folding tiny onesies, and arranging receiving blankets. The house felt enormous when Andrew was away, every sound echoing through the high ceilings. She had grown up in a modest 2-bedroom apartment with her mother and Aunt Helena, and sometimes this mansion still felt like she was playing house in someone else's life. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. A delivery man stood on the front steps, holding a bouquet of white roses. "Mrs. Miller, these are for you." Sadie frowned as she signed for the flowers. Andrew occasionally sent flowers, but never when he was traveling. The card simply read, "For making this weekend perfect. A." A strange chill ran down her spine. Andrew never signed cards with just his initial, and the handwriting looked different, more feminine somehow. That evening, as Sadie prepared a quiet dinner for one, she decided to call Andrew's hotel in San Francisco to surprise him with a goodnight call. She had the name from his business calendar, the Fairmont. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the hotel clerk said after checking their system. "We don't have any guest registered under that name this weekend. Could you check Andrew Miller? Maybe there was a mistake with the spelling." "I've checked all variations. No one by that name is staying with us." Sadie's hand trembled as she hung up the phone. There had to be an explanation. Maybe he was staying at a different hotel. Maybe the client had changed venues at the last minute. But deep in her heart, she knew. She walked to their bedroom, Andrew's cologne still lingering on his pillow. Opening his dresser drawer to look for some clue, some reasonable explanation, her fingers found a crumpled receipt that had fallen behind the wooden divider. The Ocean View Resort, Malibu Beach House Rental, weekend package for 2. The date was today's date. The name on the receipt, Andrew Miller. Sadie sank onto the edge of their bed, the receipt shaking in her hands. 7 months pregnant with his child, believing in their perfect marriage, and he was at a beach house in Malibu, with someone else. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing her distress. She placed both hands on her belly, her wedding ring catching the lamplight. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, though tears were already starting to fall. "Mommy's going to figure this out." But as she sat there in the silence of their bedroom, surrounded by the life they had built together, Sadie Miller realized that everything she thought she knew about her marriage had been a carefully constructed lie, and tomorrow, she would have to decide what to do about it. The sound of waves crashing against the Malibu shoreline filled the beach house as Andrew Miller stood on the deck, a glass of expensive wine in his hand. The sunset painted the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson, but his attention was focused on the woman emerging from the bedroom behind him. Madeline Klein stepped onto the deck wearing one of his dress shirts, her auburn hair catching the ocean breeze. At 27, she possessed the kind of confident beauty that made heads turn in boardrooms and restaurants alike. As his image consultant, she had transformed not just his professional appearance, but had awakened something in him he thought was long buried under years of domestic routine. "This place is incredible," she said, sliding her arms around his waist from behind. "I can't believe you've never brought me here before." Andrew turned in her embrace, setting his wine glass on the deck railing. I wanted it to be special. Just us. No interruptions. No pretending. No wife calling every 5 minutes to ask when you're coming home, Madeline added with a laugh that contained just a hint of cruelty. Andrew's smile faltered for just a moment. Let's not talk about that this weekend. This is about us. Of course it is, Madeline replied, trailing her finger along his jaw. But you know this can't go on forever, right? The sneaking around, the lies. I'm not getting any younger, Andrew. I want a real relationship, not stolen moments. Meanwhile, back in Beverly Hills, Sadie sat in her car outside the Malibu address she had found on the receipt. The beach house sat perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness. Andrew's BMW was parked in the driveway next to a red convertible she didn't recognize. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as she watched shadows move past the windows. 7 months pregnant, she felt the weight of her belly against the seat belt, a constant reminder of the life growing inside her, a life that was supposed to complete their family, not tear it apart. The baby kicked and Sadie placed her hand over the spot. What should Mommy do, little one? She whispered into the darkness. Back inside the beach house, Andrew and Madeline were finishing dinner at the small dining table overlooking the ocean. Candlelight flickered between them as Madeline refilled their wine glasses. You know what I love about you? She said, her voice soft and seductive. You're not like those other married men who just want to play around. You're serious about this. About us. Andrew reached across the table to take her hand. I've never felt this way before. With Sadie, everything became so predictable. The same conversations, the same routines. She's a good woman, but you're not happy, Madeline finished. I can see it in your eyes every time you mention her. You light up when you're with me. You make me feel like myself again, like the man I was before I got trapped in suburban expectations. Madeline stood and moved to sit on his lap, her arms draped around his neck. Then maybe it's time to stop pretending. Stop living a lie. It's complicated, Andrew said, though his hands were already settling on her waist. The baby's coming soon. I can't just... Can't what? Be honest about what you want? Andrew, life is short. Do you really want to spend the next 20 years pretending to be happy in a marriage that doesn't fulfill you? Outside, Sadie had seen enough. She started her car with trembling hands and drove back toward Beverly Hills, tears streaming down her cheeks. The city lights blurred past her windows as she navigated the familiar route home, or what had been home until tonight. As she pulled into their driveway, the house looked different somehow. The carefully manicured lawn, the imported Italian fountain, the security gate. It all felt like a stage set for a life that had never been real. Inside, she walked through their bedroom, seeing it with new eyes. The king-size bed they had picked out together 3 years ago. The his and hers walk-in closets. The family photos on the nightstand, their wedding day, vacations, the ultrasound picture from last month that Andrew had kissed and called our little miracle. Sadie picked up the ultrasound photo, studying the grainy black and white image of their unborn child. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, she whispered. I thought we were going to be a real family. Her phone buzzed with a text from Andrew. Meeting's running late. Don't wait up. Love you both. The casual cruelty of the lie hit her like a physical blow. Even now, even while he was with another woman, he could type those words without a second thought. Sadie set the phone down and walked to their home office. She pulled out a notebook and began making a list, her handwriting steady despite her emotional turmoil. Call Richard Hale tomorrow. Check all joint accounts. Research Seattle real estate contact. Aunt Helena. Find the best moving company. As she wrote, the baby kicked again, stronger this time. Sadie looked down at her belly and made a promise that would change everything. We're not going to be victims, little one. Mommy's going to make sure we never have to depend on anyone who can lie to us so easily. The house settled around her with its familiar creaks and sighs, but for the first time in years, Sadie Miller was planning for a future that didn't include the man sleeping in another woman's arms tonight. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp Los Angeles air that usually made Sadie feel hopeful about new beginnings. But as she sat in her car outside the law offices of Hale & Associates, her hands rested protectively over her belly, and hope had been replaced by cold determination. Richard Hale had been her family's attorney since she was a teenager, a dignified man in his 60s who had helped her mother navigate her father's estate years ago. His office, lined with leather-bound legal volumes and family photos, had always felt like a sanctuary. Sadie, he said, rising from his desk as his secretary showed her in. You sounded urgent on the phone. Is everything all right with the baby? The baby is fine, she replied, settling carefully into the chair across from his mahogany desk. But my marriage isn't. Richard's expression grew serious as he listened to her story. She spoke calmly, methodically, presenting the facts like evidence in a case. The fake business trip, the beach house receipt, the flowers she never ordered. I need to disappear, Richard, completely, before he comes back, before he can manipulate me into staying, before this baby is born into a house built on lies. Sadie, these are serious decisions. Have you considered counseling? Sometimes marriages can what? Survive systematic deception? Her voice remained steady, but her eyes flashed with quiet fire. I won't raise my child in a home where trust is optional. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her face. He had known this young woman since she was 16, had watched her grow from a grief-stricken teenager into a poised wife and mother-to-be. But this morning he saw something new in her eyes, a steely resolve that reminded him of her late mother. What exactly are you asking me to do? I want to sell the house. Today. And I want to liquidate every asset I can legally access without his immediate knowledge. That's aggressive and complicated. The house is in both your names, but I have power of attorney for financial decisions while he's traveling on business, Sadie said, pulling out a folder of documents. We set it up last year for tax purposes. I can sign for both of us on real estate transactions. Richard reviewed the papers, his legal mind already working through the implications. This will create significant complications down the road. He'll fight this. Let him fight. By then it won't matter where I am. Meanwhile, Andrew was enjoying a leisurely brunch with Madeline at a beachside cafe in Malibu. The ocean sparkled in the late morning sun as they shared eggs Benedict and mimosas, playing the part of a carefree couple on vacation. I love how relaxed you look, Madeline said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. This is how you should always be. Andrew's phone buzzed with a text from his business partner. Emergency client meeting moved to Tuesday. Can you extend your trip? He showed Madeline the message, grinning. Looks like we get an extra day in paradise. Perfect, she purred. I wasn't ready for this to end anyway. Neither of them noticed the real estate agent's car pulling into the beach house driveway, or the photographer documenting the property for the expedited listing that would go live within hours. Back in Beverly Hills, Sadie was making her second stop of the day. The Bank of America branch where they kept their primary accounts was busy with Monday morning customers, but she had called ahead to arrange a private meeting with their personal banker. Mrs. Miller, the banker said, reviewing her withdrawal requests. These are substantial amounts. Is there anything I should be aware of? I'm making some investments on behalf of my husband while he's traveling, Sadie replied smoothly. He's given me full authority to manage our finances in his absence. The banker processed the transfers. $150,000 moved to a new account in Seattle, $75,000 to a trust fund for the baby, and the liquidation of their joint savings bonds. By law, she was entitled to half of everything, but she took only what she needed for a fresh start. Her final stop was the most emotionally challenging. Their storage unit contained boxes of their life together, wedding photos, love letters from their early dating days, souvenirs from romantic trips. Sadie packed only what belonged to her before their marriage and a few items for the baby. At the bottom of one box, she found their wedding album. For a moment, her resolve wavered as she looked at their younger selves, so full of hope and promise. The Andrew in these photos looked genuinely happy, genuinely in love. But that Andrew, if he had ever really existed, was gone. She placed the album back in the box and sealed it with tape. Some chapters of life were meant to stay closed. That evening, as Andrew and Madeline shared wine and laughter at the beach house, Sadie was in her empty Beverly Hills mansion, packing the last of her belongings. The moving truck would arrive at 6 a.m., and by the time Andrew returned Sunday evening, there would be nothing left but echoes. She stood in the nursery one last time, running her hand along the crib rail. The butterfly mobile still caught the light, casting shadows that no longer looked like dancing figures but like ghosts of a future that would never be. Her phone rang. Andrew's ringtone. Hey, beautiful. His voice carried that same false warmth from Saturday. How was your day? Did you rest like I told you to? Sadie looked around the empty room, boxes stacked and labeled for shipping. It was productive, she said simply. Good. I miss you both so much. This client is being impossible, but the deal should close tomorrow. I'll be home Sunday evening with your favorite dinner. That sounds lovely, Sadie replied, her voice steady as stone. After he hung up, she placed her hand on her belly and whispered, "Daddy doesn't know it yet, sweetheart, but he's about to learn that some lies are too big to live with." The baby kicked once, firmly, as if in agreement. Sunday evening traffic on the Pacific Coast Highway was lighter than usual, giving Andrew plenty of time to savor the lingering satisfaction of his weekend with Madeline. She had dropped him at his car an hour ago, after a goodbye that promised many more weekends like this one. As he navigated the familiar streets of Beverly Hills, Andrew felt younger than he had in years. The weight of domestic expectations that usually settled on his shoulders as he approached home was replaced by an intoxicating sense of possibility. Maybe Madeline was right. Maybe it was time to stop pretending. He pulled into his driveway at 7:15 p.m., the Italian takeout from Sadie's favorite restaurant warming the passenger seat. The house looked different somehow, though he couldn't immediately place why. The landscape lighting was on as usual. The front door painted the same warm burgundy Sadie had chosen 2 years ago. But as he walked up the stone pathway, key in hand, something felt wrong. The front door opened to darkness. Not the warm glow of table lamps that usually welcomed him home. Not the sound of Sadie's favorite classical music playing softly in the background. Just darkness and an echo that seemed to bounce off empty walls. "Sadie?" he called out, setting down the takeout bags and fumbling for the light switch. The foyer lights revealed the first shock. The antique console table was gone. The mirror above it, the decorative bowl where they kept their keys, the fresh flowers Sadie arranged every week, all vanished. Andrew's heart began to race as he moved deeper into the house. The living room was completely empty, not just rearranged or redecorated, utterly vacant. The Italian leather sectional they had spent months selecting, the Persian rug that had been a wedding gift from Sadie's aunt, the entertainment center, the artwork, everything was gone. "Sadie!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic as he took the stairs 2 at a time. Their bedroom was equally barren. The king-size bed, the matching nightstands, even the curtains had been removed. Only the built-in closets remained, and when he yanked them open, he found his clothes hanging alone in vast empty spaces where Sadie's wardrobe had been. The nursery was the cruelest discovery. The room they had painted together just weeks ago was now nothing but yellow walls and carpet indentations where the crib had stood. The mobile, the rocking chair, the carefully folded baby clothes, all of it was gone, as if their child had never been expected, never been planned for, never been loved. Andrew stood in the doorway of the empty nursery, his hands shaking as the full scope of what had happened began to sink in. This wasn't a robbery. This was something far more devastating. He found the note on what had been their bed, a single white envelope with his name written in Sadie's careful handwriting. Inside was the ultrasound photo from their last doctor's appointment and a brief message. "Don't worry about looking for me. You lost me long before you realized I was gone. Our child and I deserve a life built on truth, not convenient lies. The house sold Friday. The papers are with Richard Hale. I hope she was worth it." Andrew read the note 3 times before the words fully penetrated. The house sold? Friday? He had spoken to Sadie on Friday. She had said nothing about selling their home. His phone rang. Madeline's name appeared on the screen. But for the first time since their affair began, he didn't want to answer it. "Andrew, you sound strange. Did everything go okay when you got home?" "She's gone," he said, his voice hollow. "Sadie's gone. Everything's gone." "What do you mean gone?" "The house is empty. She sold everything. She left a note." Andrew sank to the floor of the empty bedroom, suddenly feeling the weight of what he had lost. Not just furniture or belongings, but the life he had taken for granted for 8 years. "Oh my God," Madeline said, though there was something in her tone that wasn't entirely surprised. "I mean, I knew she might find out eventually, but I didn't think she'd just disappear." "You knew she might find out?" Andrew's voice was sharp now. "What do you mean you knew?" "Well, we weren't exactly careful this weekend. The flowers I had delivered to the house the way we were acting in public. Andrew, part of me hoped she would find out. This way, you don't have to be the one to end things." The flowers. The ones Sadie had mentioned on Friday evening. Andrew felt sick as he realized how careless they had been, how arrogant he had been to think his deception was foolproof. "I need to find her," he said, more to himself than to Madeline. "Why? So you can convince her to take you back?" "Andrew, this is our chance. We can finally be together without all the sneaking around." But Andrew was no longer listening. He was scrolling through his contacts, calling Sadie's mother, her friends, anyone who might know where she had gone. Each call yielded the same result. genuine surprise that Sadie had left and absolute refusal to help him find her. "She's 7 months pregnant with my child," he pleaded with Sadie's college roommate. "I just need to know she's safe." "Maybe you should have thought about your child before you decided to spend weekends with other women," came the cold reply before the line went dead. As the evening wore on, Andrew found himself alone in the empty house, surrounded by the echoes of a life he had systematically destroyed without even realizing it. Every missed dinner, every business trip, every moment he had chosen Madeline over the woman who was carrying his child. It all led to this moment of devastating clarity. He pulled out his phone and dialed Richard Hale's emergency number. "Richard, it's Andrew Miller. I need to understand what happened." "How could Sadie sell our house without—" "She had full legal authority," Richard interrupted, his voice professionally cold. "The power of attorney you signed last year gave her the right to make financial decisions in your absence. She simply exercised that right. But where is she? Is the baby okay?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss my client's whereabouts, Andrew. I suggest you focus on the legal documents that will be arriving tomorrow regarding the divorce proceedings." The line went dead, leaving Andrew alone with the silence of the empty house and the crushing realization that the perfect life he thought he was escaping from had been perfect after all, and now it was gone forever. 3 weeks after leaving Los Angeles, Sadie Hale sat in a cozy cafe in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, rain pattering gently against the window as she reviewed apartment listings on her laptop. She had legally reverted to her maiden name within days of arriving in Washington, and the simple act of signing Sadie Hale instead of Sadie Miller felt like shedding an old skin. Her Aunt Helena had welcomed her with open arms and no questions asked. At 62, Helena Hale was everything Sadie's mother had been: strong, independent, and fiercely protective of family. Her Victorian home in the Queen Anne district had become a sanctuary where Sadie could plan her future without looking over her shoulder. "How are you feeling today, sweetheart?" Helena asked, settling into the chair across from her with her own cup of coffee. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her green eyes, so similar to Sadie's own, held a mixture of concern and admiration. "Better every day," Sadie replied, her hand resting on her now 8-month belly. "I found a perfect apartment near the University District. 2 bedrooms, walking distance to the Children's Hospital, and the landlord doesn't require a co-signer." "And work?" Sadie smiled for the first time in weeks. "I have an interview tomorrow with a boutique that specializes in maternity and children's clothing. The owner is looking for someone to manage the business side while she focuses on design. My experience with Andrew's company gave me exactly the credentials she needs." Helena reached across the table and squeezed Sadie's hand. "I'm proud of you. Your mother would be proud too. You're handling this with such grace." "Some days I feel strong," Sadie admitted. "Other days I wonder if I made the right choice. But then I think about raising my child in a house built on lies, and I know I did the only thing I could." Meanwhile, back in Los Angeles, Andrew's world was crumbling piece by piece. His business partner, James, had called an emergency meeting after 3 major clients had backed out of contracts, citing concerns about Andrew's personal stability. "You look like hell," James said bluntly as Andrew slumped into the conference room chair. "When's the last time you slept or shaved?" Andrew ran his hand through his disheveled hair. It had been 3 weeks since he'd found the empty house, and every lead he'd pursued had hit a dead end. Sadie had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. "I hired a private investigator," Andrew said. "He found nothing. No credit card activity, no phone records, no hospital admissions. It's like she disappeared into thin air." "Maybe that's the point," James replied. "Maybe she doesn't want to be found." "She's carrying my child," Andrew snapped. "I have rights." "Do you? Because from what I understand, you were cheating on your pregnant wife. That doesn't exactly put you in a strong legal position." The truth stung because it was undeniable. Every lawyer Andrew had consulted had told him the same thing. Until the baby was born, his legal options were extremely limited. And even then, proving paternity and establishing custody would be an uphill battle, especially given the circumstances of Sadie's departure. Madeline had been supportive at first, playing the role of the understanding girlfriend ready to help him through his crisis. But as the weeks dragged on and Andrew became increasingly obsessed with finding Sadie, their relationship had grown strained. "This is becoming unhealthy," she said over dinner at the same restaurant where they used to meet secretly. "She left you, Andrew. She made her choice. Why can't you accept that and move on with your life?" "Because she took my child," Andrew replied, his voice hollow. Every night I think about where they are, if they're safe, if she's getting proper medical care. You should have thought about that before you decided to have an affair, Madeline said coldly. I'm sorry, but I can't keep pretending this is all going to work out. You're not the same man I fell in love with. Andrew looked across the table at the woman who had once made him feel alive again, and realized that she was right. He wasn't the same man. The confident, charming entrepreneur who had swept Madeline off her feet had been replaced by someone desperate and haunted. Are you breaking up with me? He asked. I'm doing what's best for both of us, Madeline replied, standing to leave. Get help, Andrew. Figure out who you want to be. But I can't be part of this anymore. As she walked away, Andrew was struck by the cruel irony of his situation. He had lost his wife, his child, his home, his business stability, and now the woman he thought he loved. The affair that was supposed to liberate him had cost him everything. Back in Seattle, Sadie was preparing for bed in Helena's guest room when she felt the first sharp pain. It started low in her back and radiated around to her abdomen, taking her breath away. Helena! She called out, gripping the doorframe. Her aunt appeared immediately, took one look at Sadie's face and grabbed her car keys. It's time, Helena said calmly. Let's get you to the hospital. As they drove through the rainy Seattle streets, Sadie felt a mixture of excitement and terror. Her baby was coming. The child she would raise alone. The child who would never know the father who had chosen another woman over their family. But as another contraction hit, stronger this time, Sadie realized something profound. She wasn't alone. She had Helena. She had her own strength, and she had the absolute certainty that she was doing the right thing for her child. In Los Angeles, Andrew sat in his empty house, staring at his phone and willing it to ring with news of Sadie. He had no idea that 800 miles away, the woman he had lost forever was about to bring their baby into a world where love wasn't conditional, where promises weren't broken, and where the truth was the foundation of everything. The rain continued to fall in Seattle as Sadie breathed through another contraction and whispered to her unborn baby, We're going to be okay, sweetheart. Mommy's going to make sure of it. The labor lasted 14 hours, and through every contraction, every moment of pain, Helena never left Sadie's side. The birthing suite at Swedish Medical Center became a sanctuary of determination and love, where a new family was being born in the most literal sense. I can see the first baby's head, Dr. Lisa Brennan announced at 3:47 a.m. One more push, Sadie. Sadie gripped Helena's hand and drew on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. When the first cry pierced the air, both women burst into tears. It's a girl, Dr. Brennan said, placing the tiny, perfect baby on Sadie's chest. But we're not done yet. Baby number 2 is ready to make an appearance. Sadie looked down at the small face pressed against her chest and felt her heart expand in ways she never thought possible. Hello, sweetheart, she whispered. I'm your mommy. 8 minutes later, at 3:55 a.m., the second twin arrived with an indignant wail that made the entire delivery room laugh. Another girl, Dr. Brennan announced. Congratulations, Sadie. You have 2 beautiful, healthy daughters. As the nurses cleaned and weighed the babies, Sadie found herself sobbing with relief, exhaustion, and overwhelming joy. 5 pounds, 3 ounces, and 5 pounds, 7 ounces. Small but perfect, with tiny fists and the most beautiful faces she had ever seen. What are their names? The nurse asked, preparing the birth certificates. Sadie looked at Helena, who nodded encouragingly. They had discussed this during the long months of pregnancy. Grace, Helena Hale, Sadie said, looking at the firstborn twin, and Elizabeth Rose Hale. She had chosen Elizabeth after her mother, and Rose had been her grandmother's middle name. Hale, the nurse confirmed. Not Miller. Hale, Sadie said firmly. Their last name is Hale. As the paperwork was completed, Sadie noticed the section for father's information. She left it blank. Andrew Miller had forfeited any claim to these children the moment he chose another woman over their family. The first weeks in Helena's house were a blur of sleepless nights, endless feedings, and the steep learning curve of caring for 2 newborns simultaneously. Sadie had read every parenting book she could find, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of twin motherhood. I don't know how I'm going to do this, she confessed to Helena one evening, holding Grace while Elizabeth fussed in her bassinet. It was 2 a.m. Both babies had been fed and changed, but neither wanted to sleep. The same way every mother has done it since the beginning of time, Helena said gently, picking up Elizabeth and beginning to rock her. One day at a time, one feeding at a time, one moment at a time. But alone? Other mothers have partners to help. You're not alone, Helena reminded her. You have me. And more importantly, you have something Andrew never gave you, the certainty that you're doing this for the right reasons. By the time the twins were 6 weeks old, Sadie had established a rhythm that worked for all three of them. Early morning feedings at 5 a.m., followed by a walk through the neighborhood while the babies slept in their double stroller. Afternoon naps when she could catch up on sleep or prepare bottles for the night. Evening routines that slowly began to feel natural rather than overwhelming. It was during one of these evening routines that she made the decision that would change everything. I need to get my own place, she told Helena one night after getting both babies down for what she hoped would be a 4-hour stretch of sleep. You don't need to rush, Helena replied. This house has been too quiet for too long. Having you and the girls here has been a gift. I know, and I'm grateful beyond words. But I need to prove to myself that I can do this, that I can be the mother they deserve in a home that's truly ours. Helena smiled. Your mother said almost the exact same thing to me when you were 6 months old. She was so determined to provide for you on her own terms. Did you think she was making a mistake? I thought she was making a choice that would define who she became as a mother, just like you are now. The apartment Sadie found in the university district was small but perfect. 2 bedrooms, large windows that filled the space with light, and a neighborhood full of young families where she and the girls could build a community. More importantly, it was close to Catherine Wu's boutique, where she had arranged to start working part-time when the babies were 3 months old. Moving day came when Grace and Elizabeth were 10 weeks old. As Sadie packed their belongings, which had grown exponentially with baby gear, she realized how much her life had changed since fleeing Los Angeles. The scared, pregnant woman who had sold her house and disappeared had been replaced by someone stronger, more focused, more certain of her own capabilities. Are you sure about this? Helena asked, watching Sadie fold tiny onesies into boxes. I'm sure, Sadie replied. For the first time in my adult life, I'm making decisions based entirely on what I think is best, not what someone else expects or wants. The first night in their own apartment was challenging. Grace developed colic and cried for 3 hours straight, while Elizabeth seemed determined to stay awake and observe her new surroundings. But as Sadie walked the floor with Grace, patting her back and singing lullabies, she felt a deep sense of rightness about their new beginning. At 4 a.m., when both babies were finally asleep in their cribs, Sadie stood in the doorway of their nursery and made a promise that would guide every decision for the rest of their lives. I will never lie to you, she whispered into the darkness. I will never make promises I can't keep. I will never choose anyone else over you. You will always know exactly where you stand with me, and that place will always be first. It was a promise she had never received from Andrew, but one she intended to keep for Grace and Elizabeth every single day of their lives. When the twins were 3 months old, Sadie started her part-time position at Bloom Boutique, bringing the girls with her in a portable playpen that Catherine had enthusiastically set up in the back office. It wasn't conventional, but it worked. While Sadie managed inventory and customer service, Grace and Elizabeth napped or played contentedly, often drawing smiles from customers who found the presence of babies in a children's clothing store absolutely charming. You're a natural at this, Catherine observed one afternoon, watching Sadie efficiently handle a difficult return while simultaneously feeding Elizabeth. At retail or motherhood? Sadie asked with a tired smile. Both, but I was referring to the way you make every customer feel valued, while never once compromising your attention to the girls. That's a rare skill. As spring turned to summer, Sadie settled into a routine that felt sustainable and fulfilling. The girls were thriving, developing their own personalities even at such a young age. Grace was the observer, content to watch the world around her with serious green eyes. Elizabeth was the charmer, smiling at everyone who spoke to her and reaching for anything colorful or musical. They had no contact with Andrew. He had no idea his daughters had been born, no knowledge of their names or personalities or the 1,000 small milestones that filled Sadie's days with joy. Sometimes she wondered if he even thought about the pregnancy anymore, or if he had moved on so completely that their existence had been erased from his memory. But those thoughts came less frequently as the months passed. Her new life was so full, so purposeful, that the past began to feel like someone else's story. The woman who had trusted Andrew Miller seemed like a different person entirely. Younger, more naive, less certain of her own worth. One evening, as she gave the girls their bath in the small apartment bathroom, Grace reached up and touched Sadie's face with her tiny, soap-slippery hand. It was a gesture of pure love and trust, and it hit Sadie with unexpected force. "We're going to be okay," she told them, her voice thick with emotion. "More than okay. We're going to be extraordinary." Elizabeth splashed happily while Grace continued to study her mother's face with that serious expression that was becoming her trademark. At 6 months old, they were already showing signs of the strong, confident children they would become. Children who would grow up knowing they were wanted, valued, and cherished beyond measure. That night, after the girls were asleep, Sadie called Helena. "I think I'm ready," she said. "Ready for what, sweetheart? Ready to stop hiding. Ready to build something bigger than just survival. Ready to show Grace and Elizabeth what it looks like when a woman decides to thrive." It was the mindset that would carry her through the challenges ahead and lay the foundation for everything she would accomplish in the years to come. Because Sadie Hale had learned something that Andrew Miller never understood. Sometimes the greatest gift is being forced to discover how strong you really are. 8 months had passed since the twins were born, and Sadie's small apartment in Seattle's University District had become a haven of soft laughter and gentle chaos. Grace and Elizabeth, identical girls with their mother's green eyes and stubborn chins, had filled the space with the kind of joy Sadie never imagined possible during those dark final weeks in Los Angeles. "They're getting so big," Helena observed, watching Sadie feed Grace while Elizabeth played contentedly in her bouncer nearby. The afternoon light streaming through the apartment windows caught the baby's auburn hair, a trait inherited from neither parent, but somehow perfectly their own. 8 months next week," Sadie replied, wiping Grace's chin with practiced efficiency. "I can't believe how much my life has changed." And it had changed, in ways that went far beyond the obvious presence of 2 babies. Sadie had thrown herself into her work at Bloom Boutique with a determination that impressed even the owner, Catherine Wu. What had started as a temporary position managing the business side of the children's clothing store had evolved into a partnership opportunity that Catherine had formally offered just last week. "I've been thinking about Catherine's proposal," Sadie said, settling Grace into her high chair. "Equal partners in the business. It would mean using some of the money from the house sale, but you're ready," Helena finished with a knowing smile. "You've found your footing here. The girls are healthy and happy. You've built something real." Sadie nodded, a quiet satisfaction settling over her features. "Sometimes I think about him, wondering if he ever realizes what he lost. Then I look at Grace and Elizabeth, and I know his loss was my greatest gain. The best revenge is a life well lived," Helena said, gathering Elizabeth into her arms. "And sweetheart, you're living spectacularly well." Meanwhile, 1,500 miles south, Andrew's life had become a study in gradual collapse. His business partnership with James had dissolved 6 months ago, after Andrew's inability to focus had cost them their 3 largest clients. The Beverly Hills office they had shared was now just James's domain, while Andrew worked from a cramped shared workspace in Burbank, trying to rebuild what remained of his professional reputation. The apartment he rented in Studio City was a far cry from the mansion he had lost. 1 bedroom, thin walls, and a view of the parking lot. It felt like a prison sentence that he served alone. Madeline had moved to New York for a fresh start, blocking his number after he'd called her drunk one too many times, rambling about how everything had gone wrong. "You're looking rough, man," said Tony Fernandez, Andrew's only remaining friend who still took his calls. They were meeting for coffee at a Starbucks in Sherman Oaks, the kind of casual meeting place that would have been beneath Andrew's notice in his former life. "I hired another investigator," Andrew said, ignoring Tony's observation about his appearance. His once meticulously maintained hair was too long, his expensive suits replaced by wrinkled button-downs and khakis. "This one specializes in missing persons. He thinks he might have a lead." Tony sighed deeply. "Andrew, it's been almost 2 years. Maybe it's time to accept that she doesn't want to be found. She's raising my children somewhere without their father. That's not right." "Children? I thought she was having 1 baby." "Twins," Andrew said, his voice cracking slightly. "I found out from her medical records. The investigator discovered she had twins, girls, Grace and Elizabeth. He had memorized their names from the hospital birth certificates, the only tangible proof he had that his daughters existed." "Jesus, Andrew." Tony leaned back in his chair. "2 kids you've never met. Do you really think showing up after all this time is what's best for them?" "I'm their father," Andrew insisted, but even he could hear how hollow the word sounded. The truth was, Andrew's obsession with finding Sadie and the twins had become the only thing that gave his life purpose. Without it, he would have to face the reality of what he had become, a middle-aged man who had destroyed everything good in his life for a temporary thrill that hadn't even lasted 6 months. His phone buzzed with a text from his landlord about late rent. Again, the modest inheritance from his father was nearly depleted, spent on private investigators and legal consultations that had yielded nothing but bills and false hopes. Back in Seattle, Sadie was enjoying one of her favorite parts of the week, Saturday morning at Pike Place Market with the twins. Grace and Elizabeth, now crawling and pulling themselves up on furniture, were fascinated by the bustling crowds and colorful vendor stalls. "Look at them exploring," Sadie murmured to herself, watching Grace reach for the bright flowers while Elizabeth clapped at the street musicians. "They're so confident, so curious about the world." She thought briefly about Andrew, wondering if he would recognize his own daughters if he saw them. The thought didn't bring pain anymore, just a quiet satisfaction that these beautiful, intelligent children would grow up knowing their worth wasn't dependent on someone else's validation. As they walked through the market, several vendors greeted Sadie by name. She had become part of the community here, known as the young mother who ran the successful boutique, who always had a smile and never seemed to carry the weight of bitterness that divorce often brought. That evening, after the twins were asleep, Sadie sat at her small kitchen table reviewing Catherine's partnership proposal. The numbers were solid, the terms fair, and the future bright. She pulled out a pen and signed her name at the bottom of the contract. Sadie Hale, equal partner, Bloom Boutique. As she sealed the envelope, she allowed herself a moment of pure pride. She had rebuilt her life from nothing, created a stable home for her daughters, and established herself as a successful businesswoman, all without anyone's help except Helena's loving support. Her phone rang. Helena's name appeared on the screen. "I just wanted to check in," her aunt said. "How are you feeling about everything?" "Victorious," Sadie replied, and meant it. Not in a vindictive way, but I won, Helena. I chose truth over lies, self-respect over convenience, and look what I built from that choice. Your girls are going to grow up seeing what real strength looks like, Helena said warmly. That's the greatest gift you could give them. As Sadie hung up and prepared for bed, she realized she rarely thought about Andrew anymore except to feel grateful that his betrayal had freed her to become the woman she was meant to be. Some chapters, she had learned, weren't meant to be saved. They were meant to be closed so new, better ones could begin. 1 year after becoming Catherine's business partner, Sadie stood in the newly expanded Bloom Boutique, watching Grace and Elizabeth play in the small children's corner she had designed specifically for working mothers like herself. The boutique had tripled in size, now occupying 2 connected storefronts in the University District, and featured not just children's clothing, but also a curated selection of maternity wear and accessories for new mothers. The Seattle Times wants to do a feature story, Catherine announced, waving a printed email as she entered from the back office. Local businesswoman builds thriving enterprise while raising twins as a single mother. They're calling it an inspirational success story. Sadie paused in folding a display of organic cotton onesies. I'm not sure I want that kind of attention. Why not? You should be proud of what you've accomplished. Bloom Boutique is one of the fastest growing small businesses in the district. The truth was, Sadie had worked hard to build a quiet, stable life. Recognition meant visibility, and visibility meant the possibility that Andrew might find them. Not that she was afraid of him anymore, but Grace and Elizabeth deserved to grow up without the shadow of a father who had abandoned them before they were born. Can I think about it? Sadie asked. Of course. But Sadie, you can't hide forever. What you've built here is remarkable. That afternoon, while the girls napped in the back office, Sadie found herself reviewing the boutique's financial statements. The numbers were impressive by any measure. They had cleared 6 figures in profit last quarter alone, and orders were coming in from boutiques as far away as Portland and San Francisco, who wanted to carry their exclusive designs. Her phone buzzed with a text from Helena. Dinner tonight? Want to celebrate your success? Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, Andrew sat in a dingy office in Koreatown, across from a private investigator named Joe Brennan, whose credentials were questionable, but whose rates were all Andrew could afford. I think I found something, Brennan said, sliding a manila folder across the desk. Seattle birth records. Twin girls born to a Sadie Hale at Swedish Medical Center 18 months ago. Matches your timeline. Andrew's hands shook as he opened the folder. There were photocopied documents, birth certificates with his daughters' names, Grace and Elizabeth Hale. No father listed. Hale was her maiden name, Andrew said. his voice barely above a whisper. "This is them. This is really them. The mother's listed address is in the University District. I can get you more specific information for another $500. Andrew looked at his bank statement on his phone. He had $847 in his checking account, and rent was due next week. But this was his children, his daughters. "Do it," he said. Back in Seattle, Sadie was preparing dinner for Grace and Elizabeth when Helena arrived with a bottle of wine and an expression of pure pride. "What's this about?" Sadie asked, settling the twins in their high chairs with cut-up fruit. "I wanted to toast my incredible niece," Helena said, uncorking the wine. "Catherine called me today. She's thrilled with the boutique's performance. You've exceeded every projection." Sadie smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine Helena poured. "It feels good to succeed at something that's entirely mine, you know? Every decision, every risk, every triumph, it's all mine. Your mother would be so proud. You've taken the worst betrayal imaginable and turned it into the foundation for something beautiful." That evening, after Helena left and the girls were asleep, Sadie found herself looking through the boutique's online reviews. Customer after customer praised not just the quality of their products, but the atmosphere Sadie had created. Welcoming, supportive, a place where mothers felt understood and valued. She had built more than a business. She had built a reputation, a community standing, a life that proved Andrew's betrayal had been his loss, not hers. 3 days later, Andrew was sitting in his car outside Bloom Boutique, his heart pounding as he watched through the large front windows. There she was, Sadie, looking healthier and more beautiful than he remembered, helping a customer select baby clothes while 2 toddlers played nearby. His daughters, Grace and Elizabeth. They were perfect, chubby-cheeked and active, with Sadie's green eyes and expressions that reminded him achingly of his own childhood photos. Elizabeth seemed quieter, more observant, while Grace was clearly the more adventurous twin, climbing on everything within reach. Andrew sat there for 2 hours, watching the life he had thrown away continue without him. Customers came and went, clearly comfortable with Sadie, some bringing their own children to play with the twins. She had built a community here, a support system, a whole life that didn't include him. When the boutique closed for the day, Andrew watched Sadie load the twins into a well-maintained Honda Civic and drive away. He followed at a distance, noting the route to her apartment building, the nearby park where she stopped to let the girls play, the grocery store where she shopped while other customers smiled and waved at the twins. This was what he had lost, not just a wife and children, but a life filled with simple, daily happiness. That night, Andrew called Madeline for the first time in 8 months. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice cautious. "Andrew, is everything okay?" "I found them," he said. "I found Sadie and the girls." "Oh God, Andrew, please tell me you're not planning to do something stupid. I need to see them, to talk to her, to try to explain." "Explain what? That you cheated on your pregnant wife? That you chose me over your family?" "Andrew, there's nothing to explain. You made your choice. I made a mistake, the biggest mistake of my life. Yes, you did, and now you need to live with it. Those children don't know you exist, and from what you've told me, they're better off that way." The line went dead, leaving Andrew alone in his studio apartment with the crushing weight of truth. Madeline was right. His daughters were better off without him, but that knowledge didn't make the pain of losing them any easier to bear. Back in Seattle, Sadie was tucking Grace and Elizabeth into their cribs, humming softly as they drifted off to sleep. Tomorrow she would make her decision about the Seattle Times interview. She was no longer the frightened, pregnant woman who had fled Los Angeles. She was a successful businesswoman, a devoted mother, a pillar of her community. She looked over at Grace and Elizabeth, sleeping peacefully, and felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she had built something real and lasting from the ashes of her old life. Andrew had taken away her faith in marriage, but he had inadvertently given her something more valuable, the knowledge that she was strong enough to build a perfect life entirely on her own terms. 2 weeks after Andrew had discovered where Sadie lived, he found himself sitting in a cramped legal aid office in downtown Los Angeles, his world crashing down around him in a way that made losing his family seem almost trivial by comparison. "Mr. Miller," the public defender said, her expression grave as she reviewed the stack of papers on her desk. "The IRS has filed criminal charges for tax evasion. The evidence they have suggests deliberate fraud over 3 years. You're looking at potential prison time, 5 to 7 years minimum." Andrew stared at the woman in disbelief. But I trusted my accountant. I had no idea he was falsifying the returns. Unfortunately, ignorance isn't a defense when it comes to tax fraud. The IRS considers you responsible for all filings under your name. She leaned forward. There is one option. If you can pay the back taxes, penalties, and interest, $847,000 total, they might consider a plea deal that avoids prison time. The number hit Andrew like a physical blow. I don't have that kind of money. My business failed. I lost my house years ago. Do you have any assets? Family who might help? Anyone with significant financial resources? Andrew closed his eyes, the bitter irony washing over him. The only person he knew with that kind of money was the woman he had betrayed most deeply. 3 days later, Andrew stood outside Bloom Boutique watching Sadie through the window as she helped customers while Grace and Elizabeth played in their corner. His hand shook as he clutched the legal documents that represented his entire future. He had spent the last 72 hours calling everyone he knew, but his bridges were burned beyond repair. When the last customer left and Sadie flipped the closed sign, Andrew took a deep breath and knocked on the glass door. Sadie froze when she saw him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she slowly approached the door, her hand hovering over the lock. "What are you doing here, Andrew?" she asked through the glass, her voice steady but wary. "I need to talk to you. Please. It's important." Sadie looked back at Grace and Elizabeth, who were obliviously playing with blocks, then back at Andrew. She could see something was wrong. He looked haggard, desperate, like a man who had reached the end of his rope. Against her better judgment, she unlocked the door. "You have 5 minutes," she said, stepping back as he entered. "Then you leave and you don't come back." Andrew looked around the boutique, taking in the warm atmosphere, the successful business Sadie had built, the children's corner where his daughters played without knowing who he was. Grace looked up at him with curious green eyes, Sadie's eyes, while Elizabeth continued building her tower of blocks. "They're beautiful," he said, his voice breaking. 4 minutes, Sadie replied coldly. "I'm going to prison," Andrew said abruptly. "The IRS is charging me with criminal tax fraud. I owe almost $850,000, and if I can't pay it, I'm looking at 5 to 7 years behind bars." Sadie stared at him for a long moment, processing this information. "And you thought you could just show up here, after everything you did, and ask me for money? I know I have no right." "You have no right," Sadie interrupted, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and glanced at the girls. "You chose another woman over your pregnant wife. You abandoned your children before they were even born. And now you want me to pay your debts?" Andrew sank into one of the chairs meant for nursing mothers, looking older than his 38 years. "I know what I did to you. I know what I threw away. But Sadie, I'm desperate. Prison would destroy any chance I might have of ever being part of their lives." "What chance?" Sadie's voice was ice cold. "You think there was ever going to be a chance? Do you have any idea how many nights I laid awake, 7 months pregnant, wondering if I was going to raise my children alone, while you were planning your future with another woman? I know I hurt you." "Hurt me?" Sadie laughed bitterly. "Andrew, you didn't hurt me. You destroyed me. You took 8 years of my life, my trust, my faith in love itself, and you threw it away for a woman who couldn't even be bothered to stay with you when things got difficult." Andrew winced. "Madeline left when the business started failing." "I don't care about Madeline," Sadie cut him off. "I care about the fact that you're sitting here asking me to solve your problems, when you couldn't even be bothered to solve the problems in our marriage." Grace toddled over to Sadie, sensing the tension in her mother's voice. Sadie picked her up, holding her close, and Andrew watched the interaction with an expression of profound loss. "You want to know what the real tragedy is, Andrew?" Sadie continued, her voice softer now but no less devastating. "I would have stood by you through financial problems, through business failures, tax issues, any crisis you faced. That's what partners do. They face problems together. You would have? I loved you enough to weather any storm, but you didn't give me that chance. You made the choice to lie, to deceive me, to build a secret life with another woman while I was home planning our family's future." Andrew looked at Grace, who was watching him with the innocent curiosity of a child who had no idea she was looking at her father. "I think about them every day, about what I lost." "What you threw away," Sadie corrected. "You didn't lose us in some tragic circumstance, Andrew. You made a series of deliberate choices that led to this moment." Elizabeth had wandered over and was now tugging on Andrew's shoelaces, completely unaware of the gravity of the conversation happening above her head. "They don't even know who I am," Andrew said, his voice barely a whisper. "No, they don't." And that's your fault too. Sadie set Grace down and picked up Elizabeth, studying Andrew's face carefully. She could see the desperation there, the way he seemed to be drowning in consequences he had never anticipated. I could help you, she said finally. Andrew's head snapped up. You could? Yes. The boutique is successful. I have money from the house sale, investments that have done well. I could write you a check right now that would solve all your problems. Sadie's voice was calm, matter of fact. Sadie, but I won't. Her green eyes were steel. Do you want to know why? Andrew nodded, afraid to speak. Because the man I married, the man I thought I knew, would never have asked me to bail him out of a crisis he created through his own poor choices. The man I married had integrity. He would have faced his consequences with dignity rather than coming to his ex-wife with his hand out. But the girls, if I go to prison, the girls will be exactly where they've always been, safe, loved, and cared for by someone who puts their needs first. Sadie's voice was relentless. You being in prison changes nothing for them, Andrew. They don't know you exist. I could be a father to them. No, you couldn't. Because being a father isn't about sharing DNA. It's about showing up every day, making sacrifices, putting your children's welfare above your own desires. You've proven you're incapable of that. The boutique fell silent except for the soft sounds of Grace and Elizabeth playing. Andrew sat there, facing the full magnitude of what his betrayal had cost him. Not just a wife and children, but the right to ask for help in his darkest hour. This is what you chose, Sadie continued, her voice steady and final. You chose to destroy the one relationship in your life that was built on unconditional support. You chose to burn the bridge to the one person who would have moved heaven and earth to help you through any crisis. I know, Andrew whispered. I know I destroyed everything. Yes, you did. And now you want me to save you from the consequences. But Andrew, some consequences can't be saved from. Some choices can't be undone. And some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. As Andrew stood to leave, he looked one last time at his daughters, memorizing their faces, knowing this was likely the last time he would ever see them. For what it's worth, he said quietly at the door. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. I know you are, Sadie replied. But sorry doesn't give me back the husband I thought I had. Sorry doesn't give Grace and Elizabeth the father they deserved. And sorry certainly doesn't obligate me to rescue you from problems you created for yourself. As Andrew walked away, Sadie locked the door behind him and sank into the chair he had vacated. Grace and Elizabeth continued playing, oblivious to the fact that they had just met their father for what would be the last time. She felt no guilt, no second thoughts. Sometimes the greatest kindness was allowing someone to face the full weight of their choices. 2 years later, the grand ballroom of the Seattle Marriott was filled with the city's most prominent business leaders, all gathered for the annual Pacific Northwest Entrepreneurs Awards. Sadie Hale sat at the head table, elegant in a navy blue dress that complemented her confident posture and radiant smile. At 3.5 years old, Grace and Elizabeth were at home with Helena, but their photos in Sadie's phone showed 2 bright, curious toddlers who had inherited their mother's determination and intelligence. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC announced, this year's recipient of the Outstanding Small Business Achievement Award is Sadie Hale, founder and CEO of Bloom Boutique and its subsidiary companies. The applause was thunderous as Sadie rose to accept the Crystal Award. In the 2 years since Andrew's desperate visit to her store, Bloom Boutique had expanded to 3 locations across Washington state, launched an online platform that shipped nationwide, and established a wholesale division that supplied children's clothing to boutiques across the Pacific Northwest. When I started this journey, Sadie said into the microphone, her voice clear and confident, I was a single mother with 2 infant daughters and a dream to build something meaningful. I learned that sometimes what feels like the end of your world is actually the beginning of your real life. The audience responded with warm applause, many of them familiar with Sadie's story, not the details of her failed marriage, but the inspiring narrative of a young mother who had built a thriving business empire while raising twins alone. What none of them knew was that at the back of the ballroom, barely visible in the shadows near the service entrance, Andrew Miller stood watching the woman he had thrown away receive recognition he could never have imagined when they were married. He had been released from federal prison 3 weeks ago after serving 18 months for tax fraud. The remaining time had been reduced for good behavior, but the experience had aged him beyond his years. His once expensive suit was now ill-fitting and wrinkled, purchased from a thrift store with money borrowed from his cousin. the only family member who still took his calls. As Sadie spoke about resilience and the power of starting over, Andrew felt the full weight of what he had lost crushing down on him. This poised, successful woman commanding the attention of Seattle's business elite had once been his wife, had once looked at him with love and admiration. Success isn't just about financial achievement, Sadie continued. It's about building a life of integrity, where your children can be proud of who you are and what you stand for. The words hit Andrew like physical blows. His daughters, Grace and Elizabeth, were now walking, talking little people who would grow up never knowing their father existed. He had forfeited any claim to their lives the moment he chose Madeline over his family. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse into smaller networking groups, Andrew found himself moving toward the front of the room as if pulled by an invisible force. He needed to see Sadie up close, to congratulate her, to somehow acknowledge what she had accomplished. Sadie was speaking with a group of investors when she saw him approaching. For a moment, her composure faltered, just a flicker of recognition that crossed her features before the professional mask slid back into place. "Excuse me for just a moment," she said to her companion, stepping away from the group. Andrew stopped a few feet away from her, suddenly uncertain why he had approached. In the bright lights of the ballroom, the contrast between them was stark. She radiated success and confidence while he looked like exactly what he was, an ex-convict struggling to rebuild a life he had destroyed. "Sadie," he said quietly, "congratulations. You deserve this recognition." "Thank you," she replied, her voice neutral but not unkind. "What are you doing here, Andrew?" "I got out last week. I saw the article about tonight in the paper and He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound pathetic. "I wanted to see how you were doing." "I'm doing very well, as you can see." Sadie's green eyes studied his face, taking in the changes that prison and regret had wrought. "And Grace and Elizabeth are thriving. They're speaking in full sentences now. Grace is obsessed with books and Elizabeth loves to paint." Andrew's breath caught at hearing about his daughter's development. "They sound wonderful." "They are. They're curious, kind, intelligent little girls who are growing up in a home filled with love and stability." Sadie's voice carried a quiet emphasis on the last words. "Sadie, I need you to know." "No, Andrew." She held up a hand to stop him. "You don't need me to know anything. We're past the point where your feelings or regrets matter to my life." Around them, the ballroom continued to buzz with conversation and laughter, but for Andrew and Sadie, the world had narrowed to this moment of final reckoning. "I've spent 2 years thinking about what I'd say if I ever saw you again," Andrew said. "I've rehearsed apologies, explanations, promises, and now?" Sadie asked. "Now I realize that none of it matters. You were right about everything. I destroyed the most important thing in my life for something that wasn't even real." Andrew's voice was barely audible above the ambient noise. "Madeline left me the moment things got difficult. She moved to New York, married someone else last year. The affair that cost me my family lasted less than 4 months total." Sadie absorbed this information without visible emotion. "I'm sorry it didn't work out for you." "Are you? Really?" "Yes, I am. Not because I wish we could reconcile. That bridge was burned beyond repair long ago, but because I hate seeing anyone realize they've wasted their life on something meaningless." A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne, and several business leaders nearby raised their glasses in a toast to innovation and perseverance. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "You know what the hardest part was?" Andrew asked. "Sitting in that cell, realizing that if I had just been honest with you from the beginning, if I had told you I was struggling, feeling trapped, questioning our life, you would have worked through it with me." "Yes, I would have," Sadie confirmed without hesitation. "That's what marriage is supposed to be. 2 people facing life's challenges together. But you chose to lie instead." "I chose the easy way out. The cowardly way." "Yes, you did." Sadie glanced around the ballroom at the life she had built from the ashes of their marriage. "But your cowardice gave me something I never would have discovered otherwise." "What's that?" "My own strength. My ability to not just survive betrayal, but to thrive beyond it." Sadie's voice carried a quiet pride that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with hard-earned self-knowledge. "You leaving forced me to discover who I really was underneath the role of Andrew Miller's wife." Andrew looked around at the evidence of her success, the award in her hand, the respect of her peers, the confidence that radiated from every gesture. "You're incredible, Sadie. You always were. I was just too selfish to appreciate it." "I know," she said simply, "and that was your choice. Just like building this life was mine." "Do you think?" Andrew started, then stopped, realizing how futile the question would be. Do I think what? Do you think Grace and Elizabeth will ever want to know about me? Sadie considered the question seriously. I don't know. Maybe when they're adults, they'll have questions about their father. If they do, I'll answer honestly. That you were a man who made choices that took you away from their lives before they were born. Will you tell them I loved them? Did you? Sadie's question was direct, unflinching. Because love requires sacrifice, Andrew. Love means putting someone else's needs before your own desires. When you chose to have an affair while I was pregnant with your children, what you demonstrated wasn't love, it was selfishness. The words cut deep because they were true. Andrew had spent 2 years in prison telling himself that he had loved his family, that he had simply made mistakes. But Sadie was right. His actions had never reflected love, only his own immediate gratification. I think I loved the idea of them, he admitted finally, but I never loved them enough to be the father they deserved. No, you didn't, and that's why they're better off without you. It was the final, devastating truth, and Andrew knew it. Grace and Elizabeth were growing up happy, secure, and loved. They didn't need the chaos and disappointment that his presence would bring to their lives. I should go, he said. Yes, you should. Sadie's voice wasn't cruel, just final. And Andrew? Don't come back. Don't try to contact us again. Let them grow up in peace. As he turned to leave, Andrew paused one last time. For what it's worth, I'm proud of what you've accomplished. You deserved so much better than what I gave you. I know I did, Sadie replied. And I found it. Andrew walked away through the crowd of Seattle's business elite, past the displays of success and achievement, toward the exit that would take him out of Sadie's life forever. He had no job prospects, no money, no family who would claim him. The consequences of his choices would follow him for the rest of his life. Behind him, Sadie rejoined her colleagues, seamlessly returning to conversations about expansion plans and market opportunities. She didn't watch him leave. That chapter of her life had been closed for years. As the evening wound down and she prepared to go home to her daughters, Sadie felt a deep sense of completion. The man who had nearly destroyed her had seen what she had built from his betrayal. He had witnessed her triumph, her success, her absolute independence from anything he could ever offer. Grace and Elizabeth would wake up tomorrow in a home filled with love, security, and endless possibilities. They would never know the father who had abandoned them, but they would grow up knowing they were valued, cherished, and supported by a mother who had proven that sometimes the greatest victory is building a beautiful life from the rubble of someone else's poor choices. That night, as Sadie tucked her daughters into their beds and kissed their foreheads, she whispered what had become her nightly promise. Mommy will always choose you, always. And unlike their father, she meant it. 5 years later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of Sadie's Queen Anne home as she sat at the kitchen table, watching Grace and Elizabeth get ready for their first day of kindergarten. At 8.5 years old, the twins had developed distinct personalities that never failed to amaze her. Grace with her insatiable curiosity about books and science, Elizabeth with her artistic soul and gentle compassion for every living creature. Mommy, do you think our teacher will like the drawings I made for her? Elizabeth asked, carefully placing her artwork in her new backpack. I think she'll love them, sweetheart, Sadie replied, helping Grace tie her shoes. Just like I love how thoughtful you are. And I brought 3 books to share with the class, Grace announced proudly, including the one about butterflies that we read last night. Sadie smiled, remembering the nursery she had painted in Los Angeles 9 years ago, with its butterfly mobile that had once represented hope for a future that never came to pass. This future, the one she had built with her own hands and heart, was infinitely better than anything she could have imagined back then. Are you nervous about starting school? She asked them. A little, Grace admitted, but Aunt Helena says being nervous means you're about to do something important. Aunt Helena is very wise, Sadie agreed, thinking of the woman who had become not just a surrogate grandmother to the girls, but Sadie's closest friend and most trusted advisor. As they walked to the neighborhood elementary school, one of the reasons Sadie had chosen this particular house, she reflected on how completely her life had transformed. The scared, pregnant woman who had fled Los Angeles in the middle of the night had evolved into someone she barely recognized, confident, successful, at peace with herself and her choices. Bloom Boutique now employed 12 people across its 3 locations, and Sadie had recently been approached by investors interested in franchising the concept nationwide. But success, she had learned, wasn't measured only in business achievements. It was measured in moments like this, walking her daughters to school, knowing they felt safe and loved, seeing them approach the world with confidence because they had never known anything but unconditional support. After dropping the girls off and receiving tearful hugs and promises to tell you everything when they got home, Sadie stopped by Helena's house for their traditional Tuesday morning coffee. "How did they do?" Helena asked, pouring coffee into the delicate china cups that had belonged to Sadie's mother. "Better than I did," Sadie admitted with a laugh. "I may have gotten a little teary watching them walk into that classroom." "That's because you know what a miracle this is," Helena said gently. "Not just that they're starting school, but that they're starting it as confident, secure children who have never doubted their worth." Sadie nodded, understanding what Helena meant. Grace and Elizabeth had grown up in a home where love wasn't conditional, where promises were kept, where their mother's word could be trusted absolutely. They would never experience the confusion and pain of discovering that someone they loved had been living a lie. "I got a letter yesterday," Sadie said, pulling an envelope from her purse. "From Andrew." Helena raised an eyebrow. "After all these years?" "It was forwarded through the boutique's business address. He wanted me to know that he's remarried. A woman he met in a support group for people rebuilding their lives after prison. They're expecting a baby. How do you feel about that?" Sadie considered the question seriously. "Happy for him, I think, really. He deserves a chance to be the father and husband he couldn't be with us. And his new wife deserves a man who has learned from his mistakes. Will you tell the girls? Someday when they're older and ask direct questions about their father. But for now it doesn't affect their lives in any way." That afternoon, as Sadie worked in her office above the original Bloom Boutique location, she found herself looking through old photos on her computer. There was one from Grace and Elizabeth's second birthday, the girls covered in chocolate cake laughing hysterically while Helena tried to clean them up. Another from their first Christmas in Seattle when they had decorated a small tree in her apartment and sung carols with voices that were more enthusiasm than melody. Every photo told the same story, a family built on truth, consistency, and unwavering love. Her phone buzzed with a text from the school. Grace helped a crying classmate feel better by sharing her snack. Elizabeth painted a beautiful welcome sign for the classroom. "They're both thriving, Mrs. Thompson." Sadie smiled, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she had raised children who were kind, generous, and confident enough to reach out to others. These were the qualities that mattered, not whether they had a father figure, but whether they had learned to move through the world with compassion and integrity. As the day wound down and she prepared to close the boutique, Sadie reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 7 years ago, she had thought her world was ending when she discovered Andrew's betrayal. She had believed that being abandoned while pregnant meant she was somehow not worthy of love. Now she knew better. Andrew's betrayal had nothing to do with her worth and everything to do with his character. His inability to appreciate what he had been given had freed her to discover what she was capable of creating on her own. When she picked up the girls from their after-school program, they were bursting with stories about their first day. Grace had made friends with a boy who also loved science books, and Elizabeth had convinced her teacher to hang her artwork in the classroom's special display area. "Mommy," Elizabeth said as they walked home, "Mrs. Thompson asked if our daddy would come to the parent night next week." Sadie felt her stomach tighten slightly. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that we don't have a daddy, but we have you and Aunt Helena, and that's more love than lots of kids get." "I told her that some families are different," Grace added matter-of-factly, "and different can be really good." That evening, as Sadie tucked her daughters into their beds, the same ritual she had performed every night for over 6 years, she felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the life they had built together. "Mommy," Grace said as Sadie kissed her forehead, "I'm glad our family is just us three." "Why is that, sweetheart?" "Because it means we never have to share you with anyone who might take you away from us." Sadie's eyes filled with tears as she realized her daughter had inadvertently identified what made their family so strong. In trying to protect Grace and Elizabeth from the pain of abandonment, she had given them something even more valuable, the absolute certainty that they were her first priority, always and without question. "You're right, Grace, and that will never change." As she turned off the lights and headed to her own room, Sadie paused at the window overlooking the garden where the girls played every evening. 7 years ago, she had left Los Angeles with nothing but her unborn children and a broken heart. Tonight she lived in a house filled with laughter, ran a business that brought her joy and financial security, and was raising 2 incredible little girls who would grow up knowing exactly what they meant to their mother. Andrew had given her the greatest gift possible, though he would never realize it. By abandoning them, he had forced her to discover that she was strong enough to build a perfect life entirely on her own terms. Some stories of betrayal end in bitterness and regret, but this one ended in triumph. Not the hollow victory of revenge, but the deep satisfaction of a life well lived and children well loved. As Sadie drifted off to sleep, her last thought was a promise she had kept every single day since bringing Grace and Elizabeth home from the hospital. I will always choose you. Always. And unlike their father, she had meant it. Reflection. Question based on this powerful story of betrayal, consequences, and redemption. We want to hear from you. What moment in Sadie's journey resonated most deeply with you? And what lesson about love, betrayal, or personal strength will you carry with you from her story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters and could inspire others who have faced similar challenges in their own lives. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please leave a like to help me out and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next stories. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.
A glittering afternoon at the marina. A crowd gathered, the sun blazing down, when a single choice changed everything. Two women fell into the water. One was his mistress, the other his pregnant wife. And in full view of cameras and witnesses, he reached for the mistress and let his wife sink beneath the waves. What follows is a story of betrayal, loss, and a comeback so powerful it turns regret into his prison and freedom into her victory. Stay with us, because you will not believe how this ends until we walk through it together. Tell us what time you are listening and where you are tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We would love to hear from you. The midday sun blazed over the marina, pouring its light across the polished decks and glittering surface of the water. Guests in crisp linen suits and flowing summer dresses milled about, their laughter carried on the salt-scented breeze. It was supposed to be a pleasant afternoon gathering, a display of wealth and ease by the shoreline. The sparkling glasses of champagne, the polished wood of the pier, and the sound of gulls overhead painted a picture of leisure. Yet within seconds, all of that elegance collapsed into chaos. It started with raised voices that cut through the chatter. The husband, tall and sharp in his designer shirt, stood at the edge of the dock with two women, his pregnant wife and his radiant mistress. From a distance, it looked like a confrontation that might resolve with harsh words, but those who were close enough could see the tension, the clenched fists, the flushed faces. The wife clutched her swollen belly with one hand, her other hand stretched forward in a futile attempt to hold her ground. Her eyes were wide, not only with anger but with fear. The mistress smirked, leaning slightly toward the husband, as if victory was already hers. The argument grew louder. "You think you matter here?" the mistress snapped, her voice dripping with contempt. The husband said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. He turned his face slightly toward the mistress, his jaw tight, while his wife trembled under the harsh sunlight. The guests nearby tried to pretend they were not listening, but the sudden hush in the air revealed that every ear was tuned to the escalating storm. Then it happened. A shove, a slip of a shoe on the sun-heated boards, and both women toppled into the water below. Gasps rose from the pier as a splash shattered the quiet marina. The mistress's shriek tore through the air, high and panicked. The wife's cry was different. It was softer, desperate, carrying not only fear for her life but the weight of the child she carried within her. For one suspended moment, the husband froze. His eyes darted from the splashing figures in the water to the faces of the stunned onlookers. Phones came out, their cameras instantly recording. Sunlight bounced off the screens as red recording dots appeared. The world would see this, whether he wanted it or not, and then he made his choice. With a surge of movement, he lunged forward, his arm outstretched. His hand grabbed onto the mistress's wrist, pulling her from the water in one swift motion. She coughed and clung to him, mascara streaking down her cheeks, her fingers digging into his shirt as she sobbed. He held her tightly, whispering something no one else could hear. The crowd murmured, uncertain whether to cheer his quick reflexes or recoil at what they were witnessing. But the wife was still in the water. Her hands slapped against the surface as she tried to keep herself afloat. Her hair fanned out in the waves, her maternity dress heavy and dragging her down. She reached one hand toward the pier, toward her husband, toward the man she had trusted with her life and the life of their child. Her lips parted, choking out a cry that cracked with both fear and betrayal. "Help me, please." He did not move. His arms were already occupied with the mistress, his body turned away from the flailing woman who needed him most. Around him, guests cried out in disbelief. Some leaned over the rail, shouting instructions. A man tossed a rope, but it landed just out of her reach. The cameras continued to record, steady and unblinking. Her strength began to falter. The sun glared mercilessly on the scene, highlighting every detail of her struggle. The water splashed, then grew calmer as her motions slowed. One last desperate glance rose from her eyes, meeting her husband's. It was a look that held years of love, months of sacrifice, and a single instant of devastating clarity. And then she slipped beneath the surface. The mistress sobbed in the husband's arms. The crowd erupted in shouts. The pier shook with footsteps as people scrambled, too late to do what he had refused. The only sound that lingered was the echo of her plea, carried across the bright midday air, as the cameras kept their silent witness. Only months earlier, the same couple had appeared to be the very picture of happiness. The mornings in their grand seaside villa began with sunlight pouring through tall glass windows, filling the rooms with golden warmth. Neighbors who passed by often remarked on how perfect the family looked. The husband in his tailored suits, the pregnant wife in flowing dresses that highlighted her growing belly, both seemed to live in a storybook of success and prosperity. She remembered how he once whispered promises under the same sunlight. "Trust me, we are building the perfect family," he had said, pressing her hand to his chest. At that moment she believed him. She had set aside her own career and her own ambitions because he convinced her that her role was more important at home. He told her that her future was secure, that she would never need to worry. She believed every word. The villa itself told the story of their supposed happiness. The nursery upstairs was half finished, walls painted a soft pastel, a crib already delivered and waiting to be assembled. She had carefully folded tiny baby clothes into drawers, smiling as she imagined the day her child would wear them. He had promised to be there for every step, every milestone. The house staff often saw her humming as she arranged baby blankets, her face glowing with the simple joy of anticipation. On the surface, it looked idyllic. Friends who visited would admire the expensive furniture, the gleaming kitchen, the fresh flowers always set on the dining table. They would tell her how lucky she was, how blessed she seemed. She would nod and smile, holding her belly as if cradling both her future and her husband's promise in her hands. Yet inside her, doubt had already begun to grow. The doubt did not come from a single moment, but from many small details that gathered like shadows in the corners of bright rooms. He insisted on choosing her clothes, often commenting that a certain color was more flattering, or that another outfit looked too plain. He checked her phone under the excuse of protecting her, saying he did not want her stressed by trivial calls or bothersome messages. He controlled the grocery lists, the doctor's appointments, even the hours she was allowed to rest. Each action seemed small enough to dismiss, but together they formed invisible chains. At first, she told herself it was love. She told herself he cared too much, that his control was just another form of protection. But late at night, lying awake in the big bed, she wondered when her choices had stopped being her own. When had her opinion become nothing more than a suggestion that he could dismiss with a wave of his hand? There were moments when the truth almost slipped through. One afternoon, she looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. The woman staring back looked tired, her smile thin, her eyes cautious. She remembered the vibrant woman she once was, standing in boardrooms, leading her own projects, making her own decisions. That woman felt like a ghost now. And still, in the daylight, she played the role of the happy wife. She walked through the villa with a gentle smile, answering questions from curious friends, pretending not to notice how often her husband disappeared into phone calls that lasted too long. When they dined together, he reminded her to sit straight, to smile more, to eat less sugar for the baby's sake. She obeyed because resisting only led to arguments that left her exhausted. The world outside saw perfection, but she felt the cracks forming under her feet. Every morning sunlight that streamed through the windows seemed a little harsher, revealing the truth she was trying so hard not to see. The truth did not crash into her all at once. It slipped in quietly, like water seeping under a locked door, until she could no longer ignore it. At first, it was the tone of his voice when he answered his phone. He would step out onto the terrace in the middle of the afternoon, shielding the screen with his hand, his words lowered into a softness she had not heard directed toward her in months. One afternoon, while folding baby clothes in the nursery, she heard laughter float through the open window. It was his laughter, light and warm, a sound she once lived for. But this time it was laced with something different, Curiosity pulled her to the window. She watched him standing by the pool, his phone pressed to his ear, his lips curved into a smile reserved for someone else. He spoke the words she used to hear at night. "I miss you too. Soon. Very soon." Her heart clenched, but she told herself she was imagining things. She returned to the nursery and placed a tiny blue blanket in the drawer. Still, the words echoed in her mind, louder than the waves outside. Days passed, but the signs multiplied. His shirts carried traces of perfume that was not hers, a scent too sweet and too bold for the quiet life she lived. Once, as she gathered his laundry, she found a folded note tucked inside his jacket pocket. The handwriting was elegant, the words careless. Last night was unforgettable. She stood frozen in the laundry room, the paper trembling in her hands. She confronted him once, gently, hoping she was wrong. "Who keeps calling you so late?" she asked at dinner. He did not even look up from his glass of wine. "Clients. You wouldn't understand." His dismissal cut deeper than anger could. It told her she was invisible, unworthy of an answer. The betrayal grew harder to hide. Friends began to avoid eye contact. Whispers lingered a little too long after she entered a room. One evening at a charity dinner, she caught the glance between her husband and a woman across the hall. It was quick, but it was unmistakable. His eyes softened, hers lit up, and a silent message passed between them. She pressed her hand against her belly, fighting back tears. Late one night, while he slept heavily beside her, she picked up his phone. The screen lit her face in the dark room. Messages filled the screen, sweet and intimate, written without fear. "When can I see you again? I dream of you every night. She will never know." Her chest tightened, her vision blurred. For a long time, she sat there in silence, the glow of the screen painting her face with betrayal. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. He kissed her cheek lightly, the gesture mechanical, and left for work. She stood by the window, watching his car pull away, the phone still heavy in her pocket. The sun outside was bright, almost cruel, shining on a world that looked the same while hers had already changed forever. She knew now. The life she thought she had was a lie. The promises whispered under the sunlight were hollow. The child inside her was real, but the love she had built her life on was gone. The day of reckoning came without warning. The sun was high, the sky a relentless blue, and the heat shimmered over the surface of the marina. Guests gathered on the pier, sipping chilled drinks and exchanging pleasantries, unaware that beneath the polished setting, a storm was building. The wife arrived quietly, her hand resting on her rounded belly as she walked toward the dock. She had seen enough, heard enough, and felt enough to know the truth. She had not come to argue in whispers anymore. Her steps were steady, her eyes sharp, though her heart thudded with a mix of dread and determination. The mistress was already there, standing close to the husband, her posture relaxed, her laughter echoing in the open air. She leaned toward him with the confidence of someone who believed she had already won. When the wife's shadow fell across the boards, the mistress turned, and her smile sharpened into something cruel. "You should not be here," the mistress said, her voice loud enough for others nearby to hear. Her words cut through the easy music and chatter. Conversations died down, glasses paused mid-air, and faces turned toward the confrontation. The husband shifted uncomfortably but did not move closer to his wife. His silence was its own betrayal. The wife felt her throat tighten, yet she stood tall, her voice clear. "I am his wife. I am carrying his child. I have every right to be here." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some lowered their eyes, too polite to stare openly. Others could not look away, sensing that something irreversible was about to happen. The mistress took a step forward, closing the gap between them. Her eyes flashed in the sunlight, hard and mocking. "You think that means anything to him now? Look at me. Look at us. You are nothing but an inconvenience." She reached out, brushing her fingers over the husband's sleeve as if to prove her claim. The wife's hand trembled, but not from weakness. Her voice rose, steadier than she felt. "I gave up everything for this family, and you are tearing it apart." The husband finally spoke, his tone sharp, impatient. "Enough. You are making a scene." He turned his face toward the guests, trying to control the narrative, but the red flush on his skin betrayed his unease. The mistress seized the moment. With a sudden motion, she shoved against the wife's arm, her smile twisted into triumph. The wife stumbled back, her sandals scraping against the hot boards of the dock. The gasp of the crowd rose like a wave. In that instant of imbalance, the wife reached out, grabbing at the mistress's shoulder to steady herself. The motion pulled them both toward the edge. The husband shouted something, his words lost in the chaos, but it was too late. The two women toppled together, the sunlight flashing on their dresses, the air filling with the sharp cries of alarm. The water below swallowed them with a violent splash. One scream pierced the stillness, shrill and panicked. Another cry broke softer, almost drowned before it even left her lips. On the pier, the crowd rushed forward, their voices colliding in confusion. Phones lifted instinctively, recording every second, their screens reflecting the glare of the Sunday. The husband stood frozen, staring at the roiling surface of the water. His choice would come next, and everyone would see it. The splash still rippled across the marina when the husband finally moved. For a second he had stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight. The crowd was shouting now, their voices cutting through the midday air. Some pointed to the water, others cried out the wife's name. The sun glared mercilessly on the scene, giving no cover, no shadows to hide in. Two figures struggled in the water. The mistress flailed wildly, her arms striking the waves, her voice shrill and desperate. "Help me! I cannot swim!" she screamed, coughing as water splashed against her face. The sound of her panic tore across the dock. The wife fought too, but her struggle was different. Her maternity dress had grown heavy with water, dragging her down. She tried to kick, tried to keep her head above the surface, but each movement seemed weaker than the last. Her eyes lifted toward the pier, toward the man she had trusted to protect her. "Please," she called, her voice rough, the word barely louder than the lap of the water. One hand reached upward, trembling, searching for the hand she thought would always be there. And then the choice was made. The husband lunged forward, dropping to his knees on the hot boards of the dock. His arm shot out, not toward the wife who was sinking lower, but toward the mistress who thrashed closer to the edge. His hand locked around her wrist with a grip of iron, hauling her upward with one violent pull. She collapsed against him, coughing, sobbing, her wet hair plastered to her cheeks. He wrapped his arms around her, murmuring words no one else could hear, his face pressed close to hers. Gasps spread through the crowd. Phones tilted, screens glowing, capturing the scene in steady frames. A woman in a summer hat shouted, "The wife! She is still in the water!" Another man tossed a rope, but it landed just out of her reach. The wife's head broke the surface once more. Her eyes met her husband's, and in that brief instant the world seemed to still. Her face held no anger, only disbelief. Salt water streamed from her lips as she whispered again, "Please." He did not move. The mistress clung tighter to him, and his arms tightened in response. He turned his body slightly, shielding her as if the cameras and the crowd were threats to her safety. Behind him, the wife's cries grew weaker. Her arms slapped against the water, each motion slower than the one before. Her dress billowed around her like a trap, pulling her down inch by inch. A collective murmur rose from the guests. Some leaned dangerously over the rail, shouting instructions, begging him to act. Others simply watched, their hands covering their mouths, stunned by what they were witnessing. The midday sun reflected off the surface of the water, blinding and cruel, making every second feel longer. At last, her strength failed. The wife's hand lifted once more, fingers stretching upward in a final plea. Her eyes, wide with both fear and clarity, locked onto her husband's face. She saw the truth there. She saw the choice he had already made. Then she slipped beneath the surface. The mistress whimpered in his arms, pressing her face against his chest. He stroked her hair, whispering something soft, as if nothing else mattered. Behind them, voices shouted, feet pounded, ropes were thrown again and again. But the woman who needed him most was gone from sight, swallowed by the water that glittered under the merciless afternoon Sunday. The cameras kept recording. The sea did not claim her forever. Hours later, as the sun began to soften into late afternoon, a small fishing boat spotted movement near the rocks beyond the marina. Two fishermen leaned over the edge, their weathered hands pulling her half-conscious body from the waves. Her lips were pale, her hair tangled and heavy with salt, and her swollen belly rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. They wrapped her in an old blanket that smelled of smoke and seaweed, their voices low but urgent. "Stay with us, ma'am. You are safe now." Her eyelids fluttered, but she did not respond. She clutched at the blanket weakly, as though she still expected someone else to be there, the one who had chosen to turn away. By the time the ambulance reached the dock, she was barely aware of her surroundings. The sirens wailed, echoing through the narrow streets on the way to the hospital. She lay strapped to the stretcher, her skin clammy, her hands curled around nothing. Nurses rushed to meet her as the gurney rolled through bright white hallways, voices sharp with commands. Get fluids ready. Check the fetal monitor. Call the obstetrician now. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled the air. Machines beeped steadily, their lights blinking in rhythm. Cold gel spread across her stomach as the probe traced over her skin. The monitor screen flickered, searching for the reassuring heartbeat that should have been there. For a long moment, the room was filled only with static sounds. The doctor's brow furrowed, his eyes darkening. Then silence. The silence was louder than any alarm. The steady beat they all waited for never came. The doctor lowered the probe, placing a hand gently on her arm. "I am so sorry," he said softly. His words were simple, but they shattered everything. "The baby is gone." Her eyes opened wide, confusion turning into horror. "No, you are wrong," she whispered, shaking her head. Her hand flew to her belly as though she could shield it, protect what was no longer there. Tears welled and spilled down her cheeks, sliding into her hair. She cried out, the sound raw, echoing against the white walls. Nurses shifted uncomfortably, some bowing their heads. The doctor gave her a moment, standing in quiet respect for the grief flooding through her. She clutched her stomach, rocking slightly, her cries breaking into gasps. "I promised I would keep you safe," she whispered, as if speaking to the child who had slipped away. The hours that followed blurred into shadows and fluorescent light. They moved her into a private room, curtains drawn against the sun that still burned outside. She lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, her face streaked with tears. The blanket covered her but could not warm her. Every sound of the hospital around her footsteps, carts rolling, doors opening, felt distant, as though she were already somewhere else. When the nurse returned with paperwork and soft words of comfort, she barely moved. "You are alive," the nurse said gently, placing a hand over hers. "That means you still have a chance to begin again." But the wife turned her head, staring out the window at the fading sky. Alive, yes, but hollow. Something inside her had been torn away. In that sterile room, grief became her companion. The betrayal at the dock, the cruel choice of her husband, and now the loss of the child she had carried. The future she had imagined was gone. What remained was a silence that pressed against her chest, heavier than the waves that had nearly taken her life. Days passed in a haze of grief. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of machines and the occasional footsteps in the hallway. The curtains stayed drawn, blocking the bright sun outside. She lay curled on her side, staring at nothing, her hand resting on her flat stomach. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the ghost of the life she had carried, the child who was gone. The world might have left her there, forgotten in her silence, if not for a nurse who refused to let her drown in despair. The woman was older, her hair streaked with silver, her face lined with years of compassion. She entered the room each morning with the same gentle firmness, setting down a fresh glass of water, adjusting the blanket, and speaking words that seemed small but carried weight. "You are still here," the nurse would remind her, pulling the curtains back to let light spill into the room. "That means there is still hope. Do not give him the power to take everything from you." At first the wife turned away, unwilling to hear, but slowly the words began to settle inside her, like seeds waiting for the right moment to grow. One afternoon, the nurse sat beside her and held her hand. "You are not alone, my dear. You may feel broken, but you are stronger than you know. Pain does not end you. Sometimes it is what begins you again." The words drew tears, but this time the tears were different. They carried not only grief, but also the faintest spark of possibility. That same evening, another visitor arrived. A man in a dark suit stepped quietly into the room, carrying a briefcase. His eyes softened when he saw her, and he spoke her name with warmth. It was an old friend, a lawyer she had once known before her world had been consumed by her husband's control. He had heard what happened. He had come because he refused to let her suffer alone. "I am sorry for your loss," he said, his voice steady. "But you still have choices to make. You do not have to remain under his shadow." He placed a folder on the small table beside her bed. Papers slid out, filled with words she did not want to face but knew she needed. Divorce documents, protective orders, legal steps that could free her. Her hands trembled as she touched the papers. For months, maybe years, she had felt trapped, convinced she had no way out. Now here it was, printed in black and white, a door opening. "I do not know if I can," she whispered, her voice thin. The lawyer leaned forward, his tone kind but firm. "You can. He made his choice that day on the dock. Now it is time for you to make yours. These papers are not only about ending a marriage, they are about beginning your life again. The nurse returned then, standing at the foot of the bed, her eyes filled with quiet strength. "We will stand with you," she said simply. The wife looked at them both, the two people who had shown her more care in these few days than her husband had in years. With a deep, shaking breath, she picked up the pen. Her fingers pressed against the cool metal, her hand unsteady, but her resolve stronger than she realized. She signed her name. The sound of the pen scratching against paper felt like thunder in the quiet room. For the first time since the water closed over her head, she felt air fill her lungs fully. The weight on her chest shifted, not gone, but lighter. She had lost her child, her trust, and her old life, but she had not lost herself. In that hospital room, guided by kindness and strength, she began to take back what was hers. Months passed, and the world assumed she had disappeared. Rumors spread quietly. Some whispered she had gone abroad to heal. Others claimed she had never survived that terrible day at the marina. Her husband did nothing to correct them. He continued to host events with the mistress on his arm, smiling for the cameras, pretending the scandal had blown away like sea foam. He did not expect her to rise again. But she had been preparing in silence. With the nurse's encouragement and the lawyer's guidance, she rebuilt herself piece by piece. She moved into a modest apartment far from the villa, attended therapy sessions, and joined a support group for women who had endured betrayal and abuse. The papers had been filed, the legal path set in motion. Each day, her steps grew steadier, her voice stronger, and when the time came, she chose her moment carefully. The event was grand, a corporate gala hosted in the ballroom of a luxury hotel, filled with investors, journalists, and executives. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead. Cameras flashed as the husband made his entrance, his mistress clinging proudly to his arm. He wore his usual mask of confidence, though whispers still trailed him like shadows. He believed he controlled the story. He believed she was gone. Then the doors opened. Every head turned. The room hushed, conversations breaking off mid-sentence. She stepped inside, tall and radiant in a gown of pure white that caught the light of the chandeliers. Her hair was pulled back with elegant simplicity, her posture steady, her eyes fierce. The effect was undeniable. For months they had spoken of her as broken, forgotten, erased. Now she stood before them, alive, unyielding, transformed. The mistress gasped audibly, her hand tightening on the husband's sleeve. He stiffened, his face paling as if he had seen a ghost. The cameras snapped furiously, reporters whispering her name. "It's her. She's alive." The air filled with the rustle of astonishment, 1,000 questions left unspoken. She did not rush. Her heels clicked against the polished floor with calm precision, each step deliberate. The crowd parted as though guided by some invisible force. She walked directly toward the stage, her eyes never leaving the man who had abandoned her in the water. He shifted in place, his usual arrogance cracking under the weight of her gaze. The mistress whispered something to him, her face pale, her lips trembling. He did not answer. His eyes remained locked on the woman he thought he had left behind forever. She stopped at the edge of the stage, letting the silence stretch, letting every camera capture the moment. Then she spoke, her voice calm but carrying across the ballroom. "Did you really believe I would vanish? That I would drown quietly so you could rewrite the story?" A collective gasp rippled through the room. Her words struck like lightning, impossible to ignore. She lifted her chin, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. "You all deserve to know the truth." The cameras flashed brighter, reporters leaning forward, pens scratching furiously. The husband's lips parted, but no sound came. The mistress's eyes darted toward the exits, searching for escape. But there was no escape. She had returned not as the fragile wife they remembered, but as a woman forged in betrayal and loss, standing in the light of day with the strength of survival. The gala that was meant to celebrate his empire had become the stage for her resurrection, and everyone knew it. The ballroom hung in silence after her words. The chandeliers glittered above, their light harsh on the faces of people who had once applauded the husband's power. The mistress trembled beside him, her smile gone, her eyes darting nervously across the sea of onlookers. He tried to straighten his posture, tried to summon the authority that had carried him through boardrooms and interviews, but his hands betrayed him. They shook at his sides. Then she raised her hand, and everything changed. The lawyer who had guided her through months of rebuilding stepped forward from the crowd. In his hands were folders and a small flash drive. He placed them on the podium with deliberate care, The sound echoed louder than expected, like a gavel striking in court. Murmurs rippled as journalists leaned closer, cameras ready. She opened the folder and held up photographs. "These," she said clearly, "were taken the night I nearly drowned. They show who he chose to save and who he abandoned." Gasps spread as the images passed from hand to hand, printed stills captured from phones. The husband pulling the mistress onto the dock, the wife's hand stretching above the water, ignored. The red recording light glowing in the corner of the frame. Next came documents, financial records with his signature. And these prove where his money went. Funds diverted to secret accounts, gifts for the woman he paraded as his partner while his wife carried his child. Her voice did not tremble. It rang out, steady and sharp, each word a blade. The mistress's face drained of color. She shook her head, whispering, "No, this cannot be real." But the papers in front of her left no room for denial. Reporters shouted questions. "Did you know about this? How long has this been going on? What do you have to say?" Microphones appeared, their black foam tips aimed like arrows at the husband's face. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His throat worked, his lips moved, but the only sound was a weak cough. Then she delivered the final blow. She pressed a button on the projector. The screen behind them lit up with a video, grainy but unmistakable. The marina, the sunlight, the chaos, her voice crying for help. His arm reaching for the mistress. The camera never flinched, never lied. The ballroom erupted. Investors turned to one another in shock. Some pushed back their chairs, standing abruptly. One man pulled out his phone, muttering, "Sell everything now." Another shook his head in disgust. "We cannot be tied to him anymore." The tide of power shifted in an instant. Contracts dissolved with a glance. Trust shattered beyond repair. The husband's face glistened with sweat. He tried to step forward, but his legs faltered. The mistress clutched his arm, begging him to say something, anything. But the weight of evidence was crushing. Every eye in the room judged him. Every camera captured his downfall. The wife, once voiceless, now stood as the force that toppled his empire. She did not raise her voice, she did not gloat. She simply let the truth speak for itself, and the truth was enough. By the time security approached, whispers had turned to shouts. Some called for his arrest, others demanded he resign. The mistress pulled away, realizing the empire she clung to was sinking fast. Her high heels clicked rapidly against the marble floor as she fled toward the exit. He remained behind, shoulders sagging, face pale, eyes hollow. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and headlines now stood exposed as a coward, a liar, and a betrayer. And she stood opposite him, steady, calm, her head lifted high. For the first time in years, she was the one holding all the power. The ballroom buzzed with voices, a storm of outrage and disbelief. Reporters shouted questions. Investors hurried for the exits, their phones pressed to their ears as they called to salvage what remained of their fortunes. Security stood nearby, waiting for orders that would never come. In the middle of it all, she stood still, her presence commanding more than the chandeliers above or the chaos around her. She looked at the husband, the man who had once promised her the world, the man who had let her drown in more ways than one. He could not meet her eyes. His head hung low, his shoulders slumped, his polished shoes fixed on the marble floor. He was no longer the confident figure who had strutted into the gala with his mistress. He was small now, stripped of power, crumbling under the weight of the truth. The room quieted as she stepped toward the microphone. The cameras turned, their red lights glowing. For a heartbeat, she let the silence hang, the world holding its breath to hear her speak. Her voice was calm, steady, unshaken. "I lost my child because of betrayal," she said. Her words carried through the hall, each one clear, each one undeniable. "But I will not lose myself. I will not let lies define me any longer. The truth has freed me, and it will follow him for the rest of his life." The crowd erupted in applause, not wild, but strong and certain, like a wave rolling across the room. Women in elegant gowns wiped tears from their eyes. Men shook their heads in disbelief at the man who had fallen so far. And in the middle of it all, she stood with dignity, her back straight, her eyes bright. The husband finally lifted his gaze. His lips parted, as if to speak, but nothing came. His throat tightened, his chest heaved, but no words could undo the choices he had made. The mistress was gone, the empire collapsing, and the wife he had cast aside now stood as the only truth left. Regret etched itself across his face, deep and heavy. He would carry it long after the cameras stopped recording. She stepped away from the microphone. The lawyer met her with a reassuring nod. The nurse, standing in the crowd, clasped her hands together with pride. Together they watched her walk across the ballroom, her heels clicking against the marble, each step a declaration of freedom. As she reached the grand doors, she paused. She turned back one final time, her eyes sweeping the room, lingering only briefly on the husband who now looked like a shadow of himself. "No power can bury the truth," she said softly. Though her voice was gentle, the words cut sharper than any blade. Then she turned and walked into the sunlight waiting outside. The cameras followed her until the doors closed. Inside, the man who once controlled everything stood alone, surrounded by the ruins of his pride. Outside, the woman who had been betrayed walked forward into a future she would build on her own terms. The applause still echoed behind her, but she no longer needed it. She had found something greater than approval. She had found herself.